The Pavement and the Promise, an odyssey of 15,000 kilometers. Introduction. The architect of the road, history remembers the ink, but it forgets the sweat. We remember the letters Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, documents that became the bedrock of Western civilization. But before the theology could be written, the geography had to be conquered. To understand the Apostle Paul, you must understand his feet. You must understand the callus, the blister, the swollen ankle, and the bone-deep ache of the traveler. For 30 years, this man waged a war against distance. He traveled an estimated 15,000 kilometers, a staggering figure in an era without combustion engines. It is the equivalent of walking from London to Singapore, or crossing the United States 3 times. He did not travel as a tourist. He walked along the Via Publicae, the great stone arteries of the Roman Empire, designed for the march of legions. He navigated the Via Vicinalis, the dirt tracks that connected the forgotten backwaters. He climbed mountain passes where the air was thin and bandits watched from the crags. He boarded heavy grain freighters, clinging to the deck as the Mediterranean heaved with the fury of winter storms. This is not a symbolic journey. It is a reconstruction of the dust, the wind, and the relentless forward motion that stitched the ancient world together into a tapestry of faith. Part 1. The Anatolian Ascent, the First Journey. Chapter 1. The Queen of the East. The year is roughly 46 AD. The location is Antioch on the Orontes, the capital of the Roman province of Syria. It was known as the Queen of the East, a metropolis of 500,000 souls, where the Hellenistic mind met the mystical heart of the Orient. Colonnaded avenues stretched for miles, lined with statues and bustling with the trade of the Silk Road. In the harbor, the air smelled of spices, rotting fish, and wet rope. It was here, amidst the noise of the nations, that the Holy Spirit spoke a directive that would alter history. Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. The journey began with a walk. It was a modest start, a 25-kilometer trek west to the port city of Seleucia Pieria. To Paul and Barnabas, this was a warm-up, a single day's march through the fertile Orontes Valley. But as they reached Seleucia, a massive fortress city carved into the limestone cliffs, the land ended. They stood on the stone quays, watching the stevedores load timber and grain onto the merchant vessels. These were not passenger ships. They were working beasts of burden, broad-beamed and propelled by a single massive square sail. Paul and Barnabas negotiated passage, likely finding space on the open deck among the cargo crates. As the lines were cast off and the ship lurched into the swell of the Mediterranean, the safety of the mainland vanished. They were 250 kilometers from their first destination. Chapter 2. The Island Crossing. The ship docked in Salamis, on the eastern coast of Cyprus. This was Barnabas's home, a comforting start. Salamis was a thriving commercial hub, its population swelling to nearly 100, boasting the largest gymnasium in the Greek world and a massive temple to Zeus. But the mission was not to stay, it was to move. The directive was to cross the island to Paphos, the Roman capital on the western coast. The distance was over 150 kilometers. They did not take the easy path. They moved through the interior, trekking across the Mesoria plain, a sun-baked expanse of wheat fields and olive groves. The heat in Cyprus is a physical weight, pressing down on the traveler. As they moved west, the terrain shifted. They climbed into the foothills of the Taurus Mountains, passing the copper mines that fed the Roman war machine, places of misery, where slaves died in the dark. For 2 weeks, they walked. They slept in roadside inns or under the stars. By the time they reached Paphos, they were dusty and weathered. It was here, in the shadow of the Roman governor's palace, that the spiritual war manifested. Paul confronted Elymas the sorcerer, blinding him with a word, and winning the soul of the proconsul Sergius Paulus. It was a victory, but the hardest physical test was yet to come. Chapter 3. The Gauntlet of the Taurus, From Paphos, they sailed northwest, a 400-kilometer voyage across open water to the southern coast of Asia Minor, modern Turkey. They landed at Attalia and hiked up the Sestris River to Perga. Perga was a city of marble and water, famous for its sanctuary to Artemis. But it was situated in the Pamphylian plain, a hot, humid, swampy lowland infested with mosquitoes. Many scholars believe it was here that Paul contracted the thorn in the flesh, possibly chronic malaria, a disease that induces blinding headaches and debilitating fevers. It was here that John Mark, their young assistant, looked at the swamp, looked at the towering mountains ahead, and fled back to Jerusalem. Paul and Barnabas did not turn back. They looked north, toward the Galatian highlands. To reach Pisidian Antioch, their target, they had to climb the Taurus Mountains. This was the Via Egnatia, but in these stretches, it was hardly a road, it was a gauntlet. The distance was 160 kilometers, but the elevation gain was brutal. They had to ascend from sea level to a plateau 1,200 meters high. The road wound through precipitous passes, narrow canyons where the sun barely reached the floor. This region was the domain of the Isaurians, wild mountain clans that Rome struggled to subdue. When Paul later wrote of dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers to Corinthians 11:26, he was remembering this climb. Imagine the exertion, climbing steep gradients day after day, lungs burning in the thinning air, freezing at night on the high peaks, always watching the ridgeline for bandits. When they finally crested the pass and descended onto the Anatolian plateau, they arrived at Pisidian Antioch. It was a Roman colony, a military bastion populated by veterans. Here, Paul's preaching ignited a revival and a riot. Expelled from the city, they shook the dust from their feet and kept walking. Chapter 4, The Loop of Pain. They pushed east, deeper into the interior, walking another 140 kilometers to Iconium. The road was a dusty ribbon across the high steppe, a landscape of wind and scrub brush. Driven out of Iconium by a plot to stone them, they fled to the wilder region of Lycaonia. The road to Lystra was a descent into a more primitive world. Lystra was a small market town, superstitious and volatile. It was here that the physical cost of the mission became bloody. The mob, incited by agitators from the previous cities, turned on Paul. They did not just shout, they threw stones. These were not pebbles, they were jagged rocks meant to crush skulls. Paul was beaten into unconsciousness, his body broken and bleeding, and dragged outside the city gates to be eaten by scavengers. But as the disciples gathered around the heap of bruised flesh, a miracle occurred. The chest heaved, the eyes opened, Paul stood up. Most men would have retreated to the coast, sought a ship, and gone home to recover. Paul walked back into the city. The next day, he walked another 100 kilometers to Derbe. At Derbe, they reached the limit of the journey. The Taurus Mountains and the Cilician Gates, the easy way home, were close. But Paul made a strategic decision that defies logic. He turned around. He walked back. He retraced the 250 kilometers through the danger zone back to Lystra, back to Iconium, back to Pisidian Antioch. He climbed back down the treacherous Taurus Mountains to Perga. He did this to ensure the survival of the infant churches. He traded safety for their stability. By the time they sailed from Italia back to Syrian Antioch, they had covered nearly 2,000 kilometers. They were scarred, thinner, and exhausted. But the door to the Gentiles had been kicked open. Part 2, The Continental Bridge, the Second Journey. Chapter 5, The Gates of Stone. After a time of recovery in Antioch, the edge of the road returned. The second missionary journey, approx. 4952 AD, would be more ambitious. This time, Paul chose the overland route. He walked north through Syria, crossing the Ammonius Mountains, and entered Cilicia. He passed through his hometown of Tarsus, breathing the familiar air of his youth. But he did not stop. Ahead lay the Cilician Gates. This was one of the most famous geographic features of the ancient world, a narrow gorge cut through the Taurus Mountains, the primary bottleneck between the Middle East and the Anatolian Plateau. Armies had marched through it for millennia. Alexander the Great had passed this way. Now Paul walked it. The walls of the gorge towered hundreds of feet high, the road narrowing until it seemed the mountains would crush the traveler. Emerging onto the high plateau, Paul revisited the Galatian churches Derbe, Lystra, Iconium. He picked up Timothy, a young protege, and pressed on. The team traveled hundreds of kilometers across the central Anatolian plateau, a high, wine-swept land of golden wheat and volcanic rock. They were searching for a door. They tried to turn west to Ephesus. The Holy Spirit forbade them. They tried to go north to Bithynia. The Spirit blocked the way. They were funneled northwest, walking nearly 600 kilometers of dusty roads, until they ran out of land. They arrived at Troas, the site of ancient Troy. They stood on the shore of the Aegean Sea, looking west toward a dark, unknown landmass. Chapter 6: The Invasion of Europe. At Troas, the vision came, "Come over to Macedonia and help us." This was the seismic shift. The gospel was leaving Asia. Paul boarded a ship and crossed the northern Aegean Sea. The 250-kilometer voyage took them past the imposing peaks of Samothrace to the port of Neapolis. When Paul's sandal touched the stone quay of Neapolis, a new chapter in history began. From the port, they hiked the 15 kilometers up a steep ridge to Philippi. Here, Paul stepped onto the Via Egnatia. The Via Egnatia was a superhighway of the ancient world. Paved with heavy polygonal stones, it stretched nearly 1,120 kilometers from the Adriatic to the Aegean, connecting Rome's eastern provinces to Italy. It was an engineering marvel, built to allow legions to march 30 kilometers a day. For Paul, it was a path of efficiency, but also of pain. Walking on stone is harder on the joints than walking on dirt. In Philippi, the mission was birthed in violence. Paul and Silas were stripped, beaten with rods until their backs were raw, and thrown into the stocks of a dark dungeon. The earthquake that freed them also shook the spiritual foundations of the city. Chapter 7: The road through Greece. Forced to leave Philippi, they marched west along the Via Egnatia. They walked 160 kilometers, passing through Amphipolis and Apollonia, cities that were merely mile markers in the narrative, until they reached Thessalonica. Thessalonica was a powerhouse, the capital of Macedonia, a city of 200,000 people. It possessed a massive port and bustled with the noise of politics and commerce. Paul spent weeks here, working with his hands to support himself. In the humid, cramped workshops of the city, amidst the smell of goat hair wool and loom oil, Paul wove tents and wove the gospel into the hearts of the workers. Chased out by another mob, they walked 80 kilometers off the main road to Berea, a quiet town nestled at the foot of Mount Vermion. But the peace was short-lived. The agitators followed. Chapter 8: The solitude of Athens. Paul was evacuated to the coast and put on a ship for Athens. He arrived alone. Athens in the 1st century was a city in twilight. Its political glory was gone, crushed by Rome, but its intellectual arrogance remained. Paul walked the 10 kilometers from the port of Piraeus to the city center, passing the ruins of the long walls that had once protected the city from Sparta. He wandered the agora, the marketplace, surrounded by a forest of white marble idols. Historical records tell us Athens had more statues of gods than living men. Paul, a man of fierce monotheism, felt his spirit provoked within him. He was a solitary figure in a city of philosophers. He stood at the Areopagus Mars Hill, beneath the shadow of the Acropolis and the Parthenon. He debated the Epicureans and Stoics, the intellectual elite of the world. He had no army, no wealth, no political backing. He had only a message of an unknown God who had made himself known. Chapter 9: The hub of Corinth. From Athens, Paul walked the 80 kilometers west to Corinth. The road took him along the precarious cliffs of the Cyronian rocks and across the isthmus. If Athens was the university of the ancient world, Corinth was the shipyard and the brothel. Destroyed by Rome and rebuilt as a colony, it was raw, rich, and rowdy. It sat on the narrow land bridge connecting the Peloponnese to the mainland, controlling two ports, Century on the Aegean and Lechium on the Ionian. Between these ports lay the Diolkos, a monumental engineering feat. It was a paved stone trackway that allowed ships to be hauled overland on wheeled platforms, avoiding the dangerous sea journey around the southern cape. Paul watched this constant flow of commerce ships rolling across the land, sailors from every nation, slaves, merchants, prostitutes. He settled here for 18 months. This was the longest static period of his journeys so far. He returned to his trade, working in the leather markets. The smell of curing hides would have clung to his skin as he debated in the synagogue every Sabbath. From Corinth, he wrote his letters to the Thessalonians. The church he planted here was vibrant, chaotic, and crucial, a strategic beachhead in the center of Roman trade. By the time Paul sailed from Century back to Ephesus and then to Caesarea, ending the second journey, he had covered over 50 kilometers of land and sea. Part 3. The Great Circuit, the Third Journey. Chapter 10. The Return to the Front. There was no retirement for Paul. After a brief time in Antioch, he launched the third journey approx. 53 to 57 AD. He once again walked the overland route through the Cilician Gates and across the Galatian Plateau. He was retracing his steps, visiting the communities he had birthed, checking the foundations. This leg alone, Antioch to Ephesus by land, was a trek of over 1,200 kilometers. It would have taken months of daily walking, facing the blinding sun of the Anatolian summer and the biting winds of the high steppe. Chapter 11. The Ephesian Stronghold. He arrived in Ephesus, the metropolis of Asia. With a population of nearly 300,000, it was one of the three great cities of the Eastern Empire. It was a city of magic and marble, dominated by the Temple of Artemis, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, a structure 4 times larger than the Parthenon. Paul stayed in Ephesus for nearly 3 years. This was his headquarters. He rented the lecture hall of Tyrannus, teaching daily during the siesta hours when the heat drove people indoors. From Ephesus, the gospel radiated outward like a shockwave. Paul's disciples traveled the Roman roads of the Lycus Valley, planting churches in Colossae, Laodicea, and Hierapolis. The entire province of Asia heard the word, but the success brought danger. The silversmiths, whose livelihood depended on selling idols of Artemis, rioted. The great theater of Ephesus, carved into the side of Mount Pion and capable of holding 25,000 people, filled with a mob chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." For 2 hours, the sound would have been deafening, a roar of human fury. Chapter 12. The European Loop. Driven from Ephesus, Paul did not go home. He went forward. He sailed north to Troas, then crossed to Macedonia again. He walked the familiar Via Egnatia to Philippi and Thessalonica. He walked down into Greece, Achaia, and spent 3 months in Corinth. Then, facing an assassination plot by his countrymen, he turned around and walked back north through Macedonia. This was a massive figure-8 loop around the Aegean Sea, hundreds of kilometers of hiking to ensure the churches were stable. Chapter 13. The Long Goodbye. The return trip to Jerusalem was a melancholy farewell tour. Paul sensed the end of his freedom was near. He sailed from Philippi to Troas. There, in a crowded upper room, he preached until midnight. When a young man named Eutychus fell asleep and plummeted from a 3rd-story window to his death, Paul went down, embraced him, and life returned. From Troas, Paul chose to walk alone to Ossos, a 50-kilometer hike over rugged terrain, while his companions took the ship around the Cape. It was a day of solitude, a chance to pray and prepare his heart for the chains that awaited him. He boarded the ship at Ossos and island hopped down the coast, Mytilene, Chios, Samos, Miletus. At Miletus, he summoned the elders of Ephesus. The distance was about 50 kilometers away. They came, and on the beach, Paul delivered one of the most emotional speeches in the New Testament. I know that after my departure savage wolves will come in among you. You will see my face no more. They wept, embracing him, their tears mixing with the salt spray of the Aegean. The voyage continued, Chios, Rhodes, Patara, then a ship across the open sea to Tyre in Phoenicia, then down the coast to Ptolemais and Caesarea. Finally, the walk up the mountains to Jerusalem. The third journey had covered roughly 5,500 kilometers. Part 4. The Voyage to Destiny, the fourth journey. Chapter 14. The Prisoner's Appeal. Paul's arrival in Jerusalem sparked a riot. He was arrested, saved from lynching by Roman centurions, and imprisoned in Caesarea Maritima for 2 years. But Paul had one card left to play: his Roman citizenship. I appeal to Caesar. Those words launched the final, most dangerous leg of his odyssey. He was handed over to a centurion named Julius and placed on a coaster vessel bound for Myra. Chapter 15. The Euroclydon. At Myra, they transferred to a massive Alexandrian grain ship. These were the supertankers of the ancient world, carrying hundreds of tons of Egyptian wheat to feed the mob in Rome. There were 276 souls on board. The voyage was a disaster from the start. The winds were contrary. They struggled to reach fair havens on Crete. Paul, the seasoned traveler, warned them to winter there, but the captain pushed on, hoping to reach a better harbor at Phoenix. Then, the Euroclydon struck. This was a cyclonic northeaster, a hurricane of the Mediterranean. It descended from the mountains of Crete like a hammer. For 14 days, the world was erased, the sky was black. The sun and stars, the only means of navigation, disappeared. The ship was tossed like a cork in a washing machine. The sailors frapped the hull wrapping cables under the ship to keep it from breaking apart. They threw the cargo overboard. They threw the tackle overboard. The ship drifted hundreds of kilometers, lost in the gloom. Paul stood in the heaving darkness, the ship creaking and groaning, water smashing over the deck. He was an old man now, battered by decades of travel. Yet he stood with the calm of a man who had spoken to angels. "Keep up your courage," he told the terrified crew. "God has granted me the lives of all who sail with me." Chapter 16. Shipwreck and Winter. In the middle of the night, they heard the sound of breakers. They were nearing land. They cast anchors and prayed for dawn. When the sun rose, they saw a bay. They cut the anchors and drove the ship toward the beach. But they hit a sandbar, the bow stuck fast, and the stern was torn apart by the violence of the surf. The order was given: abandon ship. The passengers jumped into the freezing, churning water, clinging to planks and debris. They washed ashore, shivering, vomiting salt water, and exhausted. They were on Malta. They were stranded for 3 months, waiting for the winter seas to come. Even here, Paul did not rest. He gathered wood, survived a viper bite, and healed the father of the island's leading official. The mission never stopped, even when the travel did. Chapter 17. The Queen of Rhodes. In the spring, they boarded another grain ship, the Castor and Pollux. They sailed north to Syracuse, Sicily, then Rhegium, the toe of Italy, and finally docked at Puteoli in the Bay of Naples. From Puteoli, the final leg was by land. Paul walked north to Capua and joined the Via Oppia, the Appian Way. The Appian Way was the oldest and most prestigious road in the empire. It was paved with massive, tightly fitted basalt stones that still exist today. It was lined with the tombs of Roman aristocrats, monuments to the glory of man. Paul walked this road not as a general in a triumph, but as a prisoner in chains, yet word had spread. As he reached the Forum of Oppius, 60 kilometers from Rome, and the Three Taverns, 50 kilometers from Rome, brothers from the city came out to meet him. The sight of them, believers he had written to but never met, filled him with emotion. He thanked God and took courage. He was not entering the lion's den alone. Chapter 18. Rome. Finally, the walls of Rome appeared. The imperial capital was a megacity of over 1 million people, a labyrinth of marble temples, sprawling aqueducts, crowded tenements, and the smoke of industry. It was the center of the world. Paul entered the city through the Copena gate. He was placed under house arrest, chained to a Praetorian guard. The walking had stopped. He could no longer travel the roads, but his words could. From his rented quarters, he wrote the prison epistles, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, letters that would travel the very roads he had conquered. He had traveled from the dusty streets of Jerusalem to the marble heart of the empire. Conclusion: the continental corridor. When the dust settled, the numbers were staggering. The first journey, approximately 2,200 kilometers. The second journey, approximately 4,500 kilometers. The third journey, approximately 5,500 kilometers. The voyage to Rome, approximately 3,500 kilometers, totaling over 15,000 kilometers. Paul's life was an act of war against geography. He conquered the Taurus Mountains, the central Anatolian plateau, the Aegean Sea, and the Mediterranean storm. He slept on hard ground, in the hulls of ships, and on the stone floors of prisons. He suffered thirst, hunger, exposure, and violence. Why? Because he possessed a vision of a world connected not just by Roman roads, but by grace. He saw the infrastructure of the empire, the ports, the ships, the highways, not as tools of Caesar, but as arteries for the blood of Christ. The path began on the dusty tracks of the East and ended on the monumental stones of Rome. But the paths that Paul opened did not close behind him. They remained open, shaping cultural, religious, and historical routes for centuries to come. In the end, it was not just cities that were connected. It was entire continents united by the relentless steps of one man on a mission. The Roman Empire fell, the roads cracked, but the path Paul walked is still being traveled by millions today, not on the Via Egnatia, but on the way of faith. He blazed through the wilderness of the ancient world.